I am Barbara Weisner. I'm the current president of the Franklin Library Foundation. I'm standing in tonight for Jennifer Leffler, who is the director of the library. So first of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors of this series. And let's see, just my head went slide. That is the Franklin Public Library Foundation. And if you would like any information on the foundation, there's a flyer up here to give information about the foundation and how you can help support it. Then also the Jerome and Dorothy Holtz Family Foundation from Carol and Tom Donovan, and also in memory of a supporter of the library, Dora Sargent. And let's see, can we move ahead one more? I'm not sure if there's something else I should mention. Yes, what I need to mention now is I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. It's Dr. Pablo Toral, and he's professor of international relations and environmental studies at Beloit College. His scholarly interests include international political economy, environmental politics, international relations theory, international governance and development, with a focus on Latin America and Europe. Pablo received his PhD in international relations from Florida International University. So thank you very much for being here this evening, and we'll put down the lights and we'll begin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So can people hear me at the back? I think you do. Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for the generous introduction, and also for inviting me back virtually last year, but in person after a couple of years. So I'm very, very happy to be here. It's been a couple of really difficult years. I hope everybody is well, physically, mentally, socially. And I also want to thank the sponsors. This is a wonderful program. I always enjoy participating in this series. I do it here and a couple other places, and it's fantastic to see how much interest there is in international issues, and most international issues. And I think one of the points that I'm going to try to make today, they're domestic, they're personal issues, and I think that's one of the goals for my talk today. I also, if you don't mind, going to go back and thank the sponsors, the friends of the library, but also in particular Dora Sargent. I had the pleasure of actually giving a presentation on Brexit, and that was a subject that she was very passionate about. And she raised a number of really interesting points, some of them very challenging, but they're all very, very interesting. So it's fantastic that, that passion and that spirit of intellectual discussion, remains here. So, I apologize to the other sponsors, not suggesting they're not as important, but, I really particularly remember that day and that exchange that we had. So that was very, very meaningful. It's exactly what this is all about. So with that, we'll be turning to the topic of today. So I was asked to talk about climate change, and I gave a presentation on climate change a few years ago, and today I'm not doing the same presentation. I decided to pitch it a little bit differently, so I will spend a little bit of time providing a little bit of background. But as I mentioned, to me, the really interesting point that I want to get across is, what can I as an individual, what can you in the audience as individuals do about this? And I would really hope that we can get that across. So I'm going to start by discussing what is President Biden's climate agenda. And when we talk about a climate agenda, we have to keep in mind that this is a collection of items that go in many different boxes or different baskets. So, but in essence, President Biden has spelled out a few goals and a few roadmaps that he's hoping to actually put money behind, and that really depends on congressional approval. But a couple of the big points here is that he wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by half in this decade. That is a very significant reduction, but it's actually a possible reduction. What's more difficult, and I will get into that in a minute, it's how we bring it back down the other 50% in the years behind, because I think the plan for the next 10 years, for this decade, is to pick up all of the low-hanging fruit. We have the technology, the economics is in place. What do we do after that? That will be the difficult part, and he won't be the president for that. But he is definitely going to lay the foundation for that plan. He wants to, and the plan is to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So that is the big picture. Again, you can't get to 250 if you don't go to the 220. So I will be spending more time thinking about or discussing the next 10 years because predicting the future 20 years out, 30 years out, it's a little bit hard. And the key is for his plan is that this process of lowering emissions to zero has to be coupled with the creation of jobs. So there's no going to be a trade-off. That is one of the pillars of the plan. So we have to lower emissions without hurting our economy. And his plan is to invest in decarbonizing policies, particularly in these sectors: construction, energy, transport, and research. And those are all very labor intensive. So the key here is that lots of people are going to be getting jobs related to what we call the green economy, those that will make us more sustainable and will reduce climate change emissions. The restoration of public lands is a really important one. We talk about climate change, and I'll talk about this for a moment, as far as emissions, lowering emissions, offsetting emissions. So one way to offset emissions is you don't necessarily eliminate all your emissions, but you plant a number of trees that will capture, that will absorb those emissions for you. And that goes into the restoration of public lands. The idea is to take advantage of formerly agricultural land or formerly former industrial land and turn it into forests, into whatever ecosystems existed there before that will capture some of those emissions. And this is very characteristic of the Biden agenda. The idea is that you don't just hit one goal. Every policy, it's going to hit at least two or more. So you're going to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions while creating jobs in these industries. You're going to lower emissions while restoring degraded land. So it's both a process of restoration, but also climate policy. And a very important component of this policy is to not do it alone. His administration is putting a lot of pressure on other countries so that they will also lower their emissions, because otherwise we're going to be lowering our emissions here and they're going to be getting a free ride because they will benefit from lower emissions and will be the ones incurring all the efforts and the cost of addressing the problem. They'll get the benefits. He has very recently signed agreements with China, India, the United Arab Emirates, and this is really important for a number of reasons. One, because China and India, along with the US, are three of the largest emitters in the world. Only those three countries emit about half of the greenhouse gas emissions. With China, the goal is to try to invest in technologies that will get us, I'm looking for the pointer here, so I think there it is. With China, the plan is to collaborate on making energy that will be renewable energy, transport, and research. With India, it's about working with farmers and agriculture so that they can increase production while lowering their emissions. And with the United Arab Emirates, even though this is a small country, this is a symbolic alliance to try to persuade all producing countries that their economies are not going to go down the drain if they actually convert. Because even if they cannot sell their oil, many of these countries, particularly in the Middle East, are very sunny. So the potential to actually become net exporters of energy is not going away if they're willing to make the right investments and transition from oil to solar. Okay, so that is the plan by the president. But as I said, the point that I really want to get across is what can we do to actually make it happen, even if the president's plan doesn't really get through Congress. So for that, I decided to organize my presentation along these 4 points. So first, what is climate change? So I will go through that somewhat quickly. I think that most people in the room, if not all, already know that. The second one is, and I think at this point, I start to get a little more analytical. So not all climate policy is equally effective. So which ones are more effective? So I really want to highlight a few of those. These 3, I want to illustrate this with evidence, with case studies. So not only evidence that some policies work better than the others, but also that they can be applied, and in fact they have been applied. And I'm going to use examples that are, within our reach. And then I will highlight some of my main points in the conclusion session. So this is the plan. So let's start with number one. So what is climate change? So climate change in itself is not really a scientific concept. In science, we use the term climate change to refer as an umbrella or as a big basket to put together many different changes that are affected by the fact that we are burning fossil fuels. When we burn fossil fuels, some of the gases that we liberate get trapped in the atmosphere, and they prevent the heat of the sun from escaping into space. We call this the greenhouse gas effect. It's like going into a greenhouse on a sunny winter day. The temperature inside is going to be higher, or even, well, in the summer too. It probably will be suffocating, if you go into a greenhouse on a very sunny day in the middle of the day in August. So the key here is, so what can we do? We either manage to find a way to get those gases that produce the greenhouse gas effect to escape into the atmosphere, or we bring them back down to Earth, retire them from the atmosphere, or we stop producing them altogether. So those are the alternatives that we have. Or keep the sun from actually sending us the heat. If you put mirrors all over the place, then we would actually be deflecting some of the heat. So it's a number of projects in place to do this. For example, when there's a big volcano that erupts, the steam of the volcano deflects some of the heat. So even though there is a trend towards warmer temperatures, there's a few exceptions in the last few years where one year might be a little bit cooler, and that's when there is a major volcanic eruption for this reason. So if we all went to Lake Michigan and we started to make to start jumping in the water, the little splashes, the little droplets of water would also reflect heat. So we call these geoengineering. Those are all options under consideration, but they're all very expensive, they're very hard to implement, and they're probably not where we should be spending a lot of time. So with that, let's start getting into what are the main causes. Well, in the social sciences, we don't necessarily. So one of the challenges that we have in climate science is the scientists will tell you from a natural science perspective what is most effective. And what we do in the social sciences is to complement that study with what is more acceptable by the people, where are the people more likely to want to invest, what is socially, institutionally sustainable. So from a physics perspective, what we know is that these are the main gases that produce climate change. And what we have here is that carbon dioxide produces the most. Methane produces more, one-on-one, compared to carbon dioxide in terms of a greenhouse gas effect. But because we actually produce more carbon dioxide, it seems like the first step should be on reducing carbon dioxide. And where do we produce carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases? In those sectors. So if you think about this, transportation, energy generation, or harvesting energy, industry, those three alone account for about a third, and a third. So if we really find ways to move ourselves with fewer emissions, if we find a way to get our utilities to produce energy with fewer emissions, and if our jobs generate fewer emissions, we really address 3/4 of the problem, and we can forget about everything else. In Wisconsin, if you really go by state, for example, or by country, the emissions are different. Wisconsin, for example, generates more emissions from agriculture than the average in the world. And that makes sense, because agriculture is a very important part of our economy. We also generate more emissions through industry, and that also makes sense, because we are a very industrial state. So we generate fewer emissions here, and more here, and more there. So that also means that what works in one place is not going to be necessarily most effective elsewhere. So that's another thing to consider. Not only where your emissions are greatest, but also what is necessary given the specifics of your community. So to do this, I'm going to be introducing some sciencey stuff, but bear with me. I will explain this to show how we look at the problem, but I will focus on the data and the conclusions. So in the social sciences, we ask ourselves, the problem is global. It's everywhere. So where do we start? So we have to make a choice. So normally we say, okay, let's look at what we call 3 levels of analysis. The individual. Okay, so if we all do our share, the problem will go away. Second point is, well, maybe not. But if our society organizes itself, and then every other society does as well, the problem will go away. But what if some societies organize themselves and others don't? Then the problem is not going to go away. And the third level of analysis is the global. So it doesn't matter what I do as an individual. It doesn't matter what we do in the US as a country. If the rest of the world doesn't do it, the problem is not going to go away. And unfortunately, it is true that at all three levels we're facing significant challenges. But it is also possible to make a difference at all three levels. But we shouldn't write one off. We shouldn't really assume that one is going to work better than the other. And that is what makes the problem so complex as well, because you have to actually get an agenda at all three levels of analysis. And if you're missing one, you're probably not going to be as successful or as effective as you could be. So let's look at the individual level of analysis. What can I, as an individual, do? Well, I can get this book by the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is kind of like an individual manual. If you do all of those things, you can actually make the problem go away. And some of the ideas that they give you there is don't drive, walk, or bike. So then you might wonder, well, look outside. So does that make a lot of sense in Wisconsin? So eat lentils. Lentil is, from a climate perspective, the most efficient source of nutrients. They use the fewest amount of resources in nature. They generate the fewest emissions. Now, are we all going to eat lentils all the time? I mean, I wonder how many of us here actually do eat lentils in the first place. So, what is the worst meal? Lamb, so don't eat lamb, or eat less of it. So, the more meats that we eat, the worse it is, because producing that amount of energy that will go into our bodies takes a lot of energy to produce. So those are the kinds of things that the Union of Concerned Scientists is telling us to do. So can you lower your thermostat in the winter and bring it up in the summer? The irony of this is that that little digital movement, you push the thermostat down in the winter, up in the summer, is actually going in the opposite direction. Americans today set their temperature, I think it's 4 degrees warmer in the winter now than they did in the 1970s. And they set their temperature 4 degrees cooler in the summer than they did in the 1970s, which means that we're much more wasteful. So, and it doesn't make sense. Why do we bring the thermostat lower in the summer and higher in the winter? From this climate perspective, it's the opposite of what we want to do. But that really shows both the power of human agency. We can actually make the difference if we pay attention to these choices, or we can make the problem worse if we actually ignore it. So the power is ours. So, but what social science suggests is, and I highlight a couple of three principles here, is the idea that we focus on what's in the news today. So today we're all really committed to climate change, but then tomorrow Russia invades Ukraine, and then we forget about climate change. We're thinking about how to help our Ukrainian community here. And then we forget that it's cold out and we raise a thermostat and we eat a wonderful lamb dish from Ukraine. So that is human nature. It's how we work. So that is the challenge that we have. Second one, loss aversion. For us to address climate change, we have to change the way we do things. And humans don't like to do that. We believe that the way we do things is probably the best way to do things, and we're not going to change. Those who do things differently are wrong, and the other ones who should change. So even if we know that in the long run, stay in the course, it's going to make things worse for us, we don't think about what's going to happen in 10 years. We don't think about what's going to happen in 15 years. Maybe I'll be dead. Maybe I need to put my kids through school, so I have to give them lamb. I can't give them lentils. They're growing up. I don't want to stunt their growth or their intellectual development. So we're thinking more about the needs of today rather than the gains of tomorrow. Particularly, humans tend to focus more on minimizing losses rather than gaining extra things. So we try to keep what we have rather than get extra things. You might be thinking, okay, that is not me. But statistically speaking, most of us humans will try to keep what we have rather than gain something else. For fear that while trying to gain the extra thing, we might lose the little that we have. So that also doesn't bode well for climate change at the individual level. The third one is what we call system neglect. The idea that we tend to avoid risks today. So one of the things that we could do is mount solar panels on our roof. But if we do that, we're incurring a cost. How long will it pay off? As opposed to keeping the thermostat fueled by we energies, which basically gets the energy from a coal power plant here in Milwaukee or a natural gas. Milwaukee County, for example, it's the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases here in Wisconsin. So one of the things I love to do in Beloit, I don't have to do this here, but let me indulge, and I apologize for those who might be watching, I love to hate Madison. Because Madison likes to brag about the fact that reducing their emissions fast. They have a plan to go carbon neutral. But the city-owned utility in Madison, what they're doing is they have a long-term agreement with a power plant in Beloit that burns natural gas, and with one in Milwaukee by We Energies that burns coal at the plant. So what they do is that reducing their emissions in Dane County by increasing our emissions here. We call that leakage. It doesn't solve the problem. It's a feel-good. It's what we call NIMBY, not in my backyard. So the Madisonians claim we solved the problem. No, you didn't. You gave us the problem. And one of the problems that we have in Beloit right now, you don't have such a big problem, is Beloit has one of the highest rates of greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the world. Wow. We have a power plant built to power 500,000 homes. There's only 30,000 people in Beloit. Who do you think is hitting their home with that? So if you divide the emissions in the power plant, it's more than 1 million per year. Per capita, Beloit is way ahead of China, is way ahead of the US, is way ahead of Wisconsin. And I think you guys in the Milwaukee area come second. Madison's emissions keep going down even though the population goes up. But this is a problem of accounting, and this is a problem that we have. This is not solving the problem, this is kicking the problem to your neighbor. So system neglect. The Madisonians are avoiding the risk of climate by lowering emissions there, and also by cleaning up the air by concentrating the pollution in Beloit or Milwaukee, where we actually continue to burn stuff so that the Madisonians can power their homes. So they're really externalizing both their emissions but also their pollution. And that, I think, from my perspective, and this is very unscientific, is wrong. It's a matter of ethics. I have a friend who said they should own their that. Yes. So pretty much, this is what we all need to do to solve the problem at the individual level. How many of you have already mapped it out? I haven't. So I try to do my best, but I'm really sure that I'm not lowering my emissions to where they need to be. For all those reasons, we need to move to the second level of analysis, which is the society level. So then, we need to address the problem. So Madison is addressing the problem by passing it on to Milwaukee and Beloit. Now, how are we addressing the problem? And one of the arguments that I've been making to the state is that the state needs to own the problem, because otherwise the Madisonians are going to get away with it. They have the brains, they have the power, they have the money, they hire the best engineers, they hire the best economists, the best lawyers. We don't. The city of Beloit does not have the people or the means. So we're really suffering from a problem of institutional capacity. And you, Milwaukee, do have the brains and the means, and but not enough people. So by population, you really also, I know this is not Milwaukee. I always tend to think about Beloit as the greater Beloit, Milwaukee, the greater Milwaukee, because the power plants that power Milwaukee and Franklin are the same. So you're pretty much, one source of climate change emissions. So we do know the cause, we know the fix, and we need to do it. But there's problems with that logic as well at the collective level. This is what we call a public goods problem. If I solve the problem in Beloit, if all of a sudden Beloit agrees to honor the agreement and offer the energy to Madison, and Beloit shuts down that plant and installs solar panels instead, we're paying for the solar panels, Madison does not, and they're getting the clean energy. So that's a free rider problem. Why would Beloit do that? why should we address the emissions of the power plant other than the fact that the quality of the air is getting worse? If that energy from the power plant is going to Madison and Green Bay as well, does it make sense to actually power Green Bay from Beloit? Imagine the amount of energy that gets wasted while traveling from Beloit to Green Bay. Okay, so the result of this is the incentives are wrong. Green Bay probably should not be powered by the plant in Beloit. But we have a problem of free riding here. Why would Madison and Green Bay take out the dirty energy if Beloit is doing that? Of course Beloit is going to do that. It has one of the lowest GDPs per capita. It's one of the poorest communities in Wisconsin. We can hardly staff our city hall. So when the company comes and says, we want to triple the size of the plant, and all these jobs are going to come, and we're going to invest billions of dollars in it, or true, except that the power plant pretty much runs itself. Once it was built, the jobs went away, and now we're stuck with the pollution. And then to make matters worse, there is a big problem because it's a little community northwest of Beloit that is adjacent to the plant that has actually broken away, and they claim, we're collecting the taxes. So now what you get is Beloit that is downstream from the plant gets the pollution and gets zero tax money. So the rich really know how to take care of themselves, and they certainly do. But what about us, the poor? Are we on the same boat? From a climate perspective, we are. So this is a problem at the collective level. We're really kicking the can. Not in my backyard, it's not going to solve the problem. It might make you feel good, but it's not going to make the problem go away. So we need, and the clock is ticking. So this is a case for government intervention. This is a classic case of public good. If the government doesn't intervene, the problem is not going to be solved. The Madison will continue to kick the pollution down the road to the poor communities. The same is happening in Iowa. The utility that serves Beloit, Alliant, is headquartered in Madison, so it makes sense that the executives don't want to pollute their air. So, and they do the same in Iowa. They found a poor community where they're concentrating a big plant that will burn natural gas, and then in Des Moines and all the other big communities, wealthier, they're going to put solar panels. So, yes, I'm exaggerating a little bit. I think Alliant does have a plan to bring their emissions to zero. But as a citizen of Beloit, I said, why did you choose us to keep your last burning, plant? So this is a case in which many. Oh, sorry, I think I went way too fast here. Where we need to bring all the stakeholders together and collaborate. But it is not in Madison's interest, again, I'm exaggerating, of course, to take some of that pollution from Beloit or from Milwaukee, even though it is in our respective interests. But because Milwaukee and Beloit don't work together, divide and rule, then the Madisonians get away with the positive externalities, the clean air, and we get the negative externalities, the pollution. So if, after all, we live in a democracy, that's the job of the government. It's a case of environmental justice. Why is it that Beloit and Milwaukee top the charts for the worst indicators, social indicators in the country, and now add to that environmental negatives? So we are really reproducing one of the ills of American society at the almost the local level, at the regional level here in southern Wisconsin. So we call this governance, not necessarily government. The government, we don't live in a totalitarian society where the government, stifles civil society. We have businesses, we have individuals, so we all have to have a stake in this. But the government has the legitimacy to lead, and you would expect that. Whenever the members of the community need to coordinate their actions to achieve a common good, we don't expect Walmart to do it for us. We expect the government to take the lead. So in this case, the key here is to actually, sorry, I'm really struggling with this. Okay, my bad. Is to actually pay attention to who we elect. It's the best way we have to have influence over the government. So if we do that and we elect the right people for the job, then all of these free riding problems, all of these public goods problems, all of these collective decision-making problems should probably go away. And at least on the climate front, we see evidence that it does. in the places where we elect the right people, but not in other places. And I will talk about Wisconsin and compare to other countries a little bit. So we know that people will respond, the politicians or people running for office will respond to the demands and the interests of their constituents. So making climate a key concern, letting them know that this is important to you, keeping it on the agenda, making it salient. Saliency is very important. And holding them accountable once they get elected is the key. Okay, so a couple of things. Foregrounding. What we mean by foregrounding is keep getting the message out there. Keep getting the message out there, like a broken record, to the people, to the community, to the elected officials, to those who are not yet elected, to those who want to get elected. And this works for humans, at least. And to the best of my knowledge, Democrats and Republicans are both humans. So this is not a matter of ideology. It's a matter of human science. Saliency matters, foregrounding matters. Both Republicans and Democrats want to get elected, and they will pick up on the cues that their constituents are putting out there. So, what do we need to do? Okay, so a couple of basic points. So what we're really talking about here, climate change, is how we power ourselves, our bodies, how we power our cars, our homes. It's all energy. The energy comes from the sun. If we could all go outside and open our mouths and just get all the sunshine and that would be all the energy, then we wouldn't have this problem. But plants, vegetables are the only organisms who can actually do this. They can actually take the energy of the sun, and through a chemical process and the combination of a couple of things, some chemicals from the soil and water, they take carbon dioxide from the air, and they turn it into sugars, and they store it in their body, and they release waste called oxygen. And that waste, this is what we call in biology circular metabolism. Waste is a human construct. In nature, there is no such thing as waste. Someone's output, the plant's waste, if you will, oxygen, is our input. Oxygen is what allows us to get the energy to our muscles. And our waste is CO2, which is input for the plant. So we need one another. We've developed this relationship. We can't get the energy directly from the sun. The plant can. And if we eat the plant, we actually get the energy from the sun in our bodies. If we turn the plant into oils, like we do in this country, corn, Brazil, sugar, we can put it in the cars. If we eat lamb, that means the some animal got sunshine from the plant, stored it in its body, and then gave it to us. So that's nature. So the plants that we burn in a coal power plant is basically biological matter. It's that was trapped at some point, and we're basically bringing it out and burning it to produce, to harvest. We don't really generate energy, we just transform it and put it into the grid so they can have the lights out. So with that in mind, so we need to make sure that the solutions that we implement keep her in mind, because the closer we can get to that, the better off we will be. Okay, so this is just a reminder. So back to that. So what are we going to do about this? So this is what the sources are. And these are the industries where that is. So any societal level approach to the problem has to reduce this, especially, particularly in these sectors. I pick on Alliant because that's what they do, but we could have picked up on, I don't know, some, probably whatever city transportation system we have. I'm sure that they're probably powered by diesel or something that is really not helping the cause. So here's the US. See, here's what we're doing. So there's good news and there's bad news here. So if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions by the US, we see that they peaked here. So this was during, and this one of the things that I like to highlight is the idea that Republicans and Democrats are human beings after all. This was the George W. Bush administration. Under Republican administration, emissions began to go down. So, and the trend continues to go down. This is the good news. The bad news is that oil remains a major source. Natural gas is getting bigger. coal is going down. This is the low-hanging fruit. Natural gas produces fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So when I said earlier that the Biden plan can actually achieve a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, you pretty much achieve that just by shutting down the coal power plants. And there's very few remaining in Wisconsin. I believe there's one in Sheboygan, there is one here in the Milwaukee area. I think there is another one. There was one in Columbus, north of Madison, which I believe is out of commission for now. So there are very few of those. So the minute that you shut down coal, you achieve significant reductions. But we're shutting down coal in many places by doing this. So let me stop bad-mouthing Alliant and now say something positive about them. Alliant is making up for the loss of generation capacity from coal by investing in solar and wind, which is so little. So in that sense, they're actually making the right choices, but not without giving up on natural gas. So they do have a number of gigantic natural gas plants that they plan to keep in operation in case, and this is a very smart idea, in case the sun doesn't always shine, in case the wind doesn't always blow. And this is the challenge with renewables. They don't always work when you need them. That's why we need to work with storage. We need to find a way to store that. Okay, so this is a graph that the New York Times put together. If you guys want to choose any state and see how they do, so I invite you to do so. They have these per state, but they chose a few. So I'm going to go through these really quickly, not necessarily to ask you to memorize all of the states, but to point out the diversity across the states. Some of the states are really dirty. Their energy mix is very dirty. In some states, it's very, very clean. So not everybody in the country is an offender. What we see in the United States is we see a significant drop in coal. This is the 21st century. At the beginning of the 21st century, about half, more than half, of the energy harvested in this country came from coal. We see it fell by half, mostly because of the increase in natural gas. You can see that nuclear remains more or less steady, but has gone down from second to third. And we see that hydro remains the same. Pretty much wherever you could build a dam, it was already built by the 1930s. There's very little more to do. But wind is up, and solar. Look at solar. Solar is probably the next growth factor here in Wisconsin in particular. Wisconsin has a huge potential for solar because it's a very sunny state. People tend to think Wisconsin is cold, but it's very, very sunny. And what's interesting about Wisconsin is that our emissions get worse in the summer when the air conditioning is humming, and that's where we get the most sunshine. So we have a huge potential to make a difference very, very easily by going through solar or to solar. So with that, this is where we are in Wisconsin. So what we see the positives is that Wisconsin's mix was mostly coal. So we're actually worse than the national average. So that's maybe the good news. It means we have huge potential. So coal was big in the early part of the century, but we can see that now we are below half, mostly thanks to natural gas. You see nuclear remains steady, no nuclear plants are going to be built, so this is just a matter of keeping the nuclear power plants in business until they're no longer needed, and probably Wisconsin will shut them all down, like most of the states are planning. But in terms of renewables, we don't do very well. So I'll just really move quickly through a number of states. If anybody wants me to stop for one, look at Minnesota. We can see Minnesota is very similar to Wisconsin, but Minnesota has made more positive changes than Wisconsin has. So we can see that they have lower coal at a faster rate than Wisconsin. So something is going on in Minnesota that is not happening here. But for those of you who think Wisconsin is bad, look at Wyoming. Oh, that's horrible. Except to look at the rise in wind. The reason why I put Wyoming here is because Wyoming, it has the potential to become a powerhouse by harvesting wind. It's very windy out there. Another one, West Virginia. Wow, that is so bad. Look at that, 91% from coal. West Virginia should be thrown into a pit. I mean, a friend of mine says that. So, no, of course I don't advocate that. That was a joke. I probably shouldn't say that. But West Virginia has even more potential than Wisconsin. But unlike Wisconsin, West Virginia has a very strong coal mining lobby. That is lobbying, if you follow the news, Mr. Manchin is under a lot of pressure by the coal industry to not give up on coal, which is the worst source of energy from a climate perspective. Our neighbors to the south, Illinois. Our neighbors to the south have a much cleaner grid thanks to nuclear. And Exelon was planning to shut down a couple of nuclear power plants last year, and they decided to keep them open because the governor really wanted to grow wind and solar. But if you think about this, the amount of growth that needed to happen would not be able to make up for the loss of nuclear. So basically, Illinois has given an injury time, if you will, to its very old nuclear power plants, hoping that they will operate well, and they seem to be operating well, until wind grows up. And the plan is, in the short run, to really phase out coal. Except that there is a gigantic, one of the biggest coal-burning power plants in the country is in southern Illinois. There's two that are really big there. One is really big, and the second one is owned by a couple of really tiny municipalities who invested a lot of wealth in them. And now if they have to shut them down, the people don't have the means to actually pay for the alternative. It's a big liability that they have. Somebody gave them the wrong advice just about 5, 7, 10 years ago. So, California. California is a lot cleaner. And you would expect that. There is no coal out there, so they got lucky. The bad news about California is it's a very sunny place, but look, only a fifth of their energy comes from solar. But you can see that it's growing a lot. So California seems to be moving in the right direction. We can see that hydro is also big and wind as well. So they've lowered natural gas, but not by a whole lot. So this actually looks better than it really is. So California can do better. Texas. Texas is one of the positive stories. What we see right now is Texas is really phasing out coal at a very, very fast pace, keeping natural gas steady. But here's what California or Texas is doing by growing wind significantly. If Texas were an independent state, it would be an independent country, be one of the top 10 producers of wind energy in the world. And there was actually an initiative by George W. Bush as well. When he was the governor of Texas, he learned about renewable energy, and he said, we want to jump on that bandwagon because we are a power state. So we want to produce energy from all sources out there. So he created lots of incentives to get Texans hooked on wind. And that really has generated a gigantic wind energy industry in Texas. If you guys followed the news last week, when the cold front went through Texas, they had to shut down a number of plants that burn fossil fuels because they were afraid they were going to freeze. Like last year, not all of them have been winterized as they were expected. The windmills continue to turn. During the coldest snap, a third of the energy of Texas came from wind. If you think about this, it should have been only 17%, which means that in cold weather, wind does a lot better than any of the alternatives. So it's a good thing that they did that. Who knows how many lives were saved for that reason. So here's another positive story. North Dakota. North Dakota is an interesting one. Very dirty, lots of cold, but look at wind. It already accounts for almost a third. And it's going to continue to grow. So North Dakota is going to be one of the powerhouses, energy powerhouses, the Texas of the US, probably about 20 years from now. But also South Dakota. So North Dakota, South Dakota, doing incredibly well. Who's to the south of South Dakota? Would it be not Oklahoma? But Oklahoma, sorry, I thought I had Iowa there. Iowa would be south and east, but so another positive about Oklahoma is like Texas. Oklahoma says we are an energy state. So if there is this thing called renewables, we want to be a part of that. We want to lead that. So Oklahoma also launched very aggressive programs to jump on the bandwagon very early. And you can see that they do even better than Texas. more than a third of their energy came from wind. And last weekend, like when it was really cold, that was almost half of the energy of the state. So it really came handy. And look at coal. This is a success story. More than half 20 years ago, less than 10% now. This state is really at the forefront. We should all want to be like Oklahoma and Texas, especially Oklahoma. Kansas, another success story. I mean, look at Kansas, how dirty they were at the beginning of the decade, and look at wind, 1/3 already. And coal will probably fall below nuclear very soon, which means that Kansas is on its way to actually reaching, eliminating all of their emissions faster and much more easily than the national average. Iowa, even better. Even better. So what we see that all of our neighbors to the west were very dirty at the early part of the 21st century. And look at Iowa. Almost half of the energy in Iowa is coming from wind. So what's going on there? So we see significant progress in terms of reducing emissions where it makes the biggest difference. In the Dakotas, in Oklahoma, in Texas, in Iowa. And I really want to call our attention to our neighbors to the west. Minnesota, the Dakotas, Kansas, Iowa. Is it because the sun doesn't shine east of the Mississippi? Or is it because the wind doesn't blow east of the Mississippi? No, it has to be something else, something they're doing that we're not. And I think I'm about to show you what I think it is. But look at Vermont. All of the energy generated in Vermont is clean. They don't generate any emissions. So Vermont is the first state to achieve that. Now you can say, well, Vermont is the size of Beloit. Okay, true. Well, not true, but I get the point. But it does matter. The fact that a little state has achieved it should not be, discounted. They still have people, they still have politics, and they had to make very tough decisions as to where to invest billions of dollars, and they decided that they were going to invest them in hydro, bio, wind, and solar, not in nuclear. They shut down the only nuclear power plant that existed in the state. Oops, sorry, I think I skipped one here. So, that was Vermont. Okay, yes, so I actually did the right thing. So the argument that I'm making here is that all of these actually were early adopters. Their legislature passed a law mandating their local utilities to actually produce a quota of energy, a certain amount, out of renewables. And they did that early on. You think about this, they all have it. Iowa was the leader in the country in the early 1980s. It's a very interesting case of leadership. Iowa is a very interesting state. It has exercised leadership in a number of areas, and certainly in terms of climate and renewables. There it is. This is the George W. Bush Texas thing, the North Dakota, the Kansas, Oklahoma, Vermont, Wisconsin. Okay, there's one thing I want to say about Wisconsin, California. The way this works is that the legislature will set a target, either a percentage of the energy mix or an amount of energy to be produced from renewables and a target year. And they will change that year. So as the target is met, they will give the utilities another target and another target year. So 5% more in 5 years, 5% more in 10 years. Wisconsin has not updated it. Wisconsin set this target in the early 21st century. It met the target in 2013, and the legislature has decided not to move the goalposts. And the utilities are saying, why would I invest money in something that I'm not mandated to do? And that's the key. All of these states, the legislature keeps raising the bar of renewables. We don't in Wisconsin. It hasn't moved in 2 decades, almost a generation. So while Wisconsin was an early adopter in a way in the early 2000s, something happened in the 2000s that froze legislative initiative and leadership in Madison. That's why I love to hate Madison. So the key is the state legislature. One quick question here. So in the sciences, sometimes we say everything fits my argument except for South Dakota. South Dakota did not pass, the legislature did not pass any law mandating the local utilities to do this. The hypothesis that I have here is that utilities from North Dakota and neighboring states moved in. They said the conditions are the same that they are in our states. So now we have all of this money that we're collecting because our share is growing. We're going to put it in South Dakota and invest in renewables there as well. So what's happening here is that some of the early adopters have developed businesses, entrepreneurs who decided to take the risk and jump into these new industries, and now they are multi-billion-dollar companies, and they're looking for investment in other parts of the country. So many of these companies that made billions of dollars from renewables in North Dakota are moving into South Dakota to do the same, and of course they're collecting the benefits from that. We really fell behind here. Wisconsin doesn't have that, so if we open up and if we do develop that, we're going to be sending a lot of money to Iowa, to the Dakotas, to Oklahoma and Texas. That's where the companies are that have really moved fast. You could say, well, they took the risk when they did, so it's going to cost us money, but they have the right to collect it since they took the risk when it was difficult. So, in Wisconsin, there is no climate plan at the legislative level. And that's the bad news, because who runs the state, who is the president matters a lot less from a renewables perspective than the laws mandated by the legislature. So this is Governor Evers' plan, but the legislature is really not giving the plan any teeth, which means that it's quite weak. It's really more a guideline rather than a plan because there is not a lot of money behind it, there is no law behind it. But his idea, and I really don't want to spend a lot of time on it because it really doesn't, as it is now, it doesn't have a lot of potential. It calls for getting carbon-free electricity by 2050, which is consistent with what is recommended by the climate scientists. Well, that's missing an A there. And also is consistent with the federal government. And that's really what you want. To be most effective, policy has to be consistent at the federal, state, and at the local level. So I was telling my students this, we have to come up with a plan. Beloit does not have a plan. When the climate plan passes the federal Congress, and in one way or another it will, there will be billions of dollars available for communities to implement climate plans, climate policies, but you have to have a plan. Beloit doesn't have any plan other than collecting Madison's dirt. And that's really not going to qualify you for money. Madison will collect the money because they will show a report that says that they have reduced their emissions significantly by sending them to Milwaukee and Beloit. So Milwaukee's case is harder because now you guys in this area are picking up Madison's emissions. Beloit's case is harder. Madison is looking wonderful, telling the federal government that investing in Madison makes the most sense because they have lowered emissions at a faster rate than Beloit or Milwaukee. And the feds are not going to look at the data. They're going to go with Madison's plan because the data is correct. Madison is lowering their emissions while ours are increasing and yours are more or less staying the same. So whatever bureaucrat is looking at the applications from, let's say there is one from Beloit, one from Milwaukee, one from Franklin, one from Madison, they're going to give it to Madison. But they did it the wrong way. It does not solve the problem. That's a case of very, very bad policy. Okay. Again, that's why we need the state to actually act. So, what is the legislature's plan? There isn't one. That's a generous question mark. There isn't one, so let's not waste our time. So, but fortunately for this cause of climate change, other states are actually moving. Not in Wisconsin, but other states. By the turn of the century, if you think about this, most states, the main source of energy was coal. Now there's fewer. Still have a few here in the heartland, but you can see that it's changed in different places. So let's just zoom in on some of that. So again, back to being a little bit sciencey. What we're talking about here is what we call an energy transition. An energy transition is something that only happens every few generations, and what that means is that we're moving from one source of energy to another. From biomass, we used to burn stuff to keep ourselves hot, to keep ourselves warm, to power the trains. We moved to coal, from coal to oil. Now we seem to be moving away from coal, natural gas, into renewables. So what makes a transition possible? One of the keys here is technology. You have to have the technology to do it. Another one is cost. But what I want to call your attention to here is what we call the political economy, particularly now. Climate change is a serious problem that requires fast action, but it's in everyone's interest not to be a first mover. Because whatever changes you make, you'll have to pay for. If you wait for the others to take the lead, by the time you make your move, things will be cheaper. Technology will be more mature, it'll be cheaper. So we have all of this going against us. So the key then becomes, in terms of politics, what would explain what happened west of the Mississippi, that these guys all adopted the right policies, while we, the east of the Mississippi, we didn't. So it's a combination of two things. What we call political economy is the interests of the powers that be. The powerful actors in each state that have the power over policy lobby for climate policy or against climate policy. What this suggests is that those who wanted to adopt climate policy had access to the legislature in the Dakotas, in Iowa, in Oklahoma, in Texas. States that don't really come to mind as being particularly progressive or liberal, but that the ones that are making the biggest difference. And if you look at Wisconsin, Minnesota, or Illinois, those east of the Mississippi, we tend to be more left-leaning, and yet we're really far behind on the cause of climate. So what that means is that the actors that make policy west of the Mississippi were lobbying the legislature for green policies. But the ones who are lobbying for greenery here do not have the power to do that because there is very powerful lobbies against that policy. The second one is what we call historical institutionalism. A radical change such as a transition can only happen if a number of stars align, and if you miss that juncture, you're not going to be able to make it. So those are the two factors that really determine success to the west and failure to the east. So let's get into a little bit more specifics here. So you need a renewable lobby, which exists in all of those places. The renewable industry is very active, funding campaigns in the Dakotas to get the legislature to continue to demand greenery, not in Wisconsin. You need the environmentalists to be active, and they're active here, but we don't have a green lobby, a green industry here. And then the left is active here. The left normally will jump on any campaign that calls for more government intervention, regardless of whether it's for greenery or for healthcare. Who is against the greenery here? So we have the carbon-intensive industries. All those industries that have to use metals, those that build cars, trains, all of those require a lot of energy, so they're very afraid that if we go with wind and solar, they're not going to be able to keep the lights on, their energy will be expensive, and they'll have to outsource the jobs to China. So any state, any community that has a lot of manufacturing is going to lobby the legislature against greenery. And that's where Beloit comes in, that's where the Milwaukee area comes in, not so much Madison. They don't make a lot of stuff there. We make it for them. The second thing is the right. The dirty industries, if you will lobby for no government policy for greenery, and the right will go with them because they believe that subsidies is more government, and they will oppose more government, regardless of the reasons in general. So the coalition of the dirty industries plus the right will try to block a coalition. And the third one is, well, I kind of like conflated the two, the carbon-intensive industry lobby and the heavy industry. So in the end of the day, the states in which the bloc coalition is more powerful than the support coalition will stay on the dirty side of energy. And those where the support coalition is stronger will go green. And that's what happened in the Dakotas. That's what happened in Iowa. That's what happened in Oklahoma. The oil industry was interested in renewables because they said we can actually diversify. If there is more energy out there, that is actually good because the oil industry is very dependent on fluctuations of price. And if you can actually control the production of renewables at home, well, that's depending on the crisis in the Middle East. So what actor was critical for the development of renewables in Iowa and also in the Dakotas? The farmers. The farmers were very concerned about the fear of losing the farm, the fact that the kids didn't seem to be very interested. Because of a number of weather events, it was harder to farm. And then wind farms and solar farms promised them extra revenue. It was an insurance mechanism for them. So the renewables industry joined forces with the farmers and said, why don't we do this together? I lease your land, you get X thousands of dollars every year, regardless of the weather. No matter what, you get it, and then you keep farming if you want, but you don't have to. And the farmers organized and lobbied for greenery in those states. And that really was the defining factor for the success of greenery. So, if we're moving forward, we need to really make a huge difference, and this is what current projections look like. And with this, I'm going to start to bring it to a close so that we can have a conversation. So we see that we are going to grow solar significantly and wind. This is where companies are really starting to make investments. And the ones that really stand to make a fortune are those early adopters, those companies from Iowa and the Dakotas, Oklahoma, and Texas. So I'm going to breeze through this. So this is where we are today, well, 2 years ago, 2020. This is where we are producing renewables from solar and wind. And I'm going to go from 2020 to 2050, which is where we need to achieve carbon neutrality. So if you think about that, you can look at where we are right here and see what happens. So that's 2025. This will be 2030. This will be 2035, 2040, 2045, 2050. So if you think about this, if we move to renewables, we basically kill the oil industry in Texas and Oklahoma, and we become the energy powerhouse of the country. And that's why the oil industry in Texas and Oklahoma decided to jump on this bandwagon. So oil is on its way out. We can't just stick with it. We have to diversify. And maybe we move out of Tulsa and we move to, I don't know, Des Moines, Iowa. So the business sector is moving. They're basically moving, and this is the future that they see. Whether Wisconsin can capitalize on that depends on whether our legislature starts removing legislative roadblocks to hold renewables back. They've become very good at that. Okay, Gone with the Wind. Okay, so from 2020 to 2050, that's a significant change. Call your attention to these windy spots here. So these are some of the more effective ways of harvesting energy from wind offshore operations. So we do have a number of policy options. So not every state, not every community has to do it the same way. Some will want to subsidize, some will want to do something else. The more common policies that we use are taxes, tax the dirty, not the clean, subsidize the clean, not the dirty. We subsidize gasoline in this country more than we subsidize renewables, invest in research and development. This has been the one renewable portfolio standards that really made the difference west of the Mississippi. That's when the legislature said X percentage of your energy is to come from renewables 5 years from now. It'll be increasing 1% per year for the next 20 years. You know the rules, you go do it, and you figure out what works in the context of your state. What they do in Europe, they've done feed-in tariffs. What they do is that they let a utility freeze the rate of electricity for 25 years, and they do their calculations to know that in the course of those 25 years, they're gonna make back the money they invested plus a profit. So the Europeans prefer to do it that way. The Americans at the state level are doing number 5. Europe did it number 6. Green power programs are also important, but they haven't really been very effective. Net metering programs, same thing. So those are more of individual level policies, but really the biggest difference here has been in terms of 5 and 4, but there's a lot of potential to work with 1. Okay, I said, people can do it, we can make a difference. So I have a few of the policies implemented by Columbus here in Wisconsin, just west of here, if you ever want to visit. So a little community like Columbus can actually make a difference. They did all those things. So I'm really not gonna, bore you by going through those one by one. But if you want to do climate policy, look at Columbus. You don't have to be a big city. Every small community can do it. You can do education campaigns, you can do tax benefits, subsidies, number of things that they did out there that seem to have worked. Hire somebody who has a background in sustainability. It's important to have someone who knows what you're doing. So can we do it? Yes, we can, but we can't do it alone. Even if we get our act together, we can't expect that Iowa will save the world for us. We need to do our fair, but we also need to get other countries to do that. And this is why we need China to get to work. This is why we need India to get to work. And I showed at the beginning that Biden wants China, India, United Arab Emirates to do this. And to achieve carbon neutrality, we need to make sure that our temperature stays through there. And I will show you right now that things are not looking very good, because this is how much China produces. This is the US. But look at China, look at Asia. The countries that look really good here is, let me point out if I can even find them, is Latin America. Latin America is the cleanest region in the world because they have been using renewables pretty much since they became independent. So they haven't really had to change in general. So if they did it, we probably could do it too. So projections are that the EU will continue to lower emissions. The EU has been steadily lowering emissions since the 1970s. So we peaked in 2007. They peaked in 1970. That's before I was born. So it's almost like they have been in the future for a long time now. So China, however, look how fast it's going up. So they continue to get worse and worse, but it seems like China is starting to peak. So this is where we need to work. So at current projections, we really need to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, or else things can really spiral out of control. Looking at keeping the increase in temperature within 2 degrees, 1.67 if possible, to be able to prevent significant weather events that are really costing us a lot in terms of life and infrastructure. This is where we are. Some countries are doing better than others. You can see, as I mentioned, the EU is doing better. China, if you look at per capita, their promises will actually make them exceed the US. So China has gone from dismissing the US as a country trying to put hurdles on their development to taking climate change very seriously. In part because the regime has been under a lot of fire because of the pollution of the air in Chinese cities. People take to the streets to protest the government's inability to clean up the air. And the government has been very afraid that this could escalate into a revolution. So China has actually, for political as well as health reasons, decided to really make climate policy a cornerstone of their economy, and also because China has discovered that if the entire world switches to renewables, they'll have to buy the blades, they'll have to buy the solar panels, and there is about 3 million people in China who make solar panels now. It's a big industry, and it continues to grow. So that's how they see it. So this is the US, this is where we're at. The projections based on where we're at right now don't really see coal going away. So we really need to keep doing better, harder work. So to conclude, so addressing climate change has to require action at the individual level, at the social level, but also at the global level. I mean, really, if the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians don't do it, it doesn't matter what we do. But also we can't expect that the Dakotas will get us out of this crisis. We in Wisconsin have to do better as well. And also in Wisconsin, we need to tell Madison, this is not the way you do it, Madison. You're not lowering your emissions. You are kicking them to Milwaukee and Beloit. That's not solving the problem. You're basically giving the problem to poor communities with few resources, and that doesn't bode well for the state of Wisconsin. Another point is the energy transition is on its way. It's necessary, and there is a lot of benefits to come out of it if we actually write it well. We can be an adopter and benefit from the jobs, the technology, the quality of life, the health benefits, or we can be a laggard and deal with the problems like we will be in Beloit for the next quarter century, unfortunately, because that power plant is not going to go away. It'll be the last one to shut down in Wisconsin, except for maybe we're hoping that one in Milwaukee will stay open a little later, and you guys will collect the pollution for us. Hopefully they all shut down at the same time. Or maybe we'll collect the pollution and take it to Madison. Okay, so a couple more. The Midwest has a lot of potential to become an energy powerhouse because it's sunny and it's windy. So conditions are right here. So it'd be the place to produce renewable energy at the lowest cost. And this is, if you allow for a free market, this is where it will come. It will move from Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma to the upper Midwest or to the lower Midwest. So some states are already capitalizing on that. The Dakota is the leaders, Iowa is the leader. We're not, and I think we're missing an opportunity, but we can catch up. And the key really is our legislature, like it was for them. So, the biggest difference we can make based on the evidence is by voting. Putting solar panels on your rooftop is probably not going to make a huge difference. It's going to send a message to the neighborhood that we need to do this, but you're going to be spending more money than you need. You can actually eliminate your emissions, doing other things that are a lot cheaper, not so flashy. But in the end of the day, if your neighbors don't do it, you're not going to make the difference that you need to make, and we really are in the hands of the legislature. So we need to elect the people who will take the problem seriously and will have the vision, but also the ability, the entrepreneurship to come up with the regional policy so that we can actually catch up to Iowa and the Dakotas. And unfortunately, we don't have that right now. So get informed and vote. If she could, she'd be a legislator. She would get my vote for sure. Okay, because she's doing it right. She's been doing it for billions of years. Millions of years. All right, and with that, I'll really bring it to a close. If anybody has any comments, concerns, recommendations, by all means, feel free to send them to me via email. You can do that now. So should I turn it over to you?
Well, no, not really, but I will take the mic.
Yes. The big one here.
Big one.
I think I saw a hand back there somewhere.
Okay. So it's time for some questions or discussion, and I have a mic, so we'll start here.
Yes,
This should be. Yes.
well, thank you for the presentation. I would like to go beyond details to the basics, and that is, we all agree that the Earth is warming. The question is, why? We have the ice ages. There was climate change. The question is, are we in a natural trend of warming? And does our contribution of gases accelerate this warming? And if that is the case, then we cannot stop the warming. My second point is this. Changing to a green energy, and I'm talking about a very aggressive situation in Germany, and that's why I got my accent, where they are closing nuclear power plants, they're closing coal-fired power plants, they're finding themselves in a situation where they have to import 40% of the energy from Russia, which now has a leverage on them. So my point is, when we go away from carbon-based energy sources to renewable, it has to be synchronized. That's my point.
Yes, Thank you. Those are great questions. Very tricky ones. So in one of my slides, I had the IPCC. The acronym is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. That is a group of thousands of scientists from around the world that have been doing research on science, and they publish their findings on a United Nations website. And their conclusion is, you're right, that our climate has gone through periods of warming and cooling. The argument that they develop is that this is human-induced because of the burning of fossil fuels. It's a correlation, a very clear correlation, that the increase right now, the rise in concentration of CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere is really high, and that the increase is the highest that we have in the geological record. There's been periods where there's been as much concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere as we have right now, but it took thousands of years to get there. So we're talking about a significant increase in 7050. We think about 7050 as the baseline to calculate the rise in temperatures. That's because in 1750 is when we began to burn fossil fuels at gigantic scales, the Industrial Revolution. So that's one of the conclusions of the IPCC. Of course, in science, we always say that until proven wrong, but that seems to be the best what the evidence is suggested. On Germany, that's right. Germany has decided to close down coal, which was devastating for some communities, and it has decided to shut down nuclear, which does not produce greenhouse gases. So France generates 70% of its energy from nuclear. It generates a lot of emissions in the building of the plants, but not in operating the plants. It has other problems that come with it, but not there. And Germany has decided, for domestic political reasons, to shut down nuclear. The nuclear, anti-nuclear movement in Germany has always been very strong, in part because of Germany's legacy, World War II, the peace movement associated nuclear with an aggressive Germany, things that we can really get into that I find absolutely fascinating. But to the point of Germany, Germany has decided to shut down coal and nuclear to go with renewables. But as I mentioned in the case of Illinois, Illinois wanted to do that too, but couldn't, because the capacity that they're getting from from this is Illinois now, from coal and nuclear, they couldn't make up if they shut it down with renewables until 20 years from now. So what do? Do you shut down the lights for 20 years? Can't do that. What Germany did is they decided to do what most states of the US are doing: shut down coal and nuclear and make up for the difference with natural gas, which Germany doesn't produce. But Russia is a willing seller. And you're absolutely right. One of the problems we see in Ukraine is Germany does not want to commit to sanctions against Russian nuclear gas, natural gas, because then the Germans will freeze if Putin turns off the faucet. And that's why the US is telling Germany, we'll send you lots of natural gas if necessary. It is a really difficult policy problem. But what Germany needs to do is to move to renewables. But they can't do it if they don't invest in some natural gas in the short run. It's the way to do it. Now, do they need to get the natural gas from Russia? So, well, the Germans decided to do it that way. Now they're dealing with the consequences.
Well, the other situation in Germany is an awkward one, in that they're closing their nuclear power plants, whereas the European Union declared nuclear power and natural gas as green energy sources. So they're in a very awkward situation.
Yes, and that is another fascinating topic. I mean, this is about European politics. The European Union is coming up with a set of renewables that will qualify for subsidies, tax incentives, etc., etc. And France said, well, I want to put nuclear there because 70% of my energy comes from nuclear. I don't want all the money to go to Denmark or to Sweden. And Germany said, well, I want to put natural gas there because that's the direction our economy is going. Neither nuclear nor natural gas are ideal. But the Germans want to collect some subsidies as well. So the issue hasn't been settled. The European Commission has proposed that, but there is significant opposition, and the big countries are really lobbying in different directions. France wants nuclear to be considered renewable, Germany doesn't. Germany wants natural gas to be considered renewable, France doesn't. Spain wants none of those to be considered renewables because Spain, like Wisconsin, is sunny and windy. They want wind and solar to be considered renewables. Germany and France don't like that because they don't produce, it's not as sunny and it's not as windy. Italy is with Spain, so is Scandinavia. So what we see is these three trends, and my hypothesis is that they will come up with a compromise that would allow both France and Germany to qualify for some subsidies for their respective industries, but at a much smaller rate than wind and solar. So most of the subsidies will end up going to Scandinavia and Southern Europe. That's my hypothesis. And that will also incentivize the development of wind and solar in Germany and France. And Germany has a very well-developed solar industry already. Germany will probably continue to grow that. But you're very well informed, so I really commend you for that, and you're raising excellent points. Politics very often gets in the way.
Hi, two questions.
Yes, yes.
Is it possible for the United States to supply enough natural gas to Germany? That's question one. And can't?
No, so if the US can supply enough gas to Germany, I thought the light was on.
Okay, now we got it. I'm talking.
Just hold it closer. Does that help?
I'll bite it. Can the United States supply enough natural gas to Germany to replace Russia? Number one. Number two, has anyone measured, or the plants have anything to do with this? Like, is there less carbon, CO2 being absorbed by plants while we're making more CO2? So has anyone measured the effect of, like you always read about Brazil, taking all the forests away?
Right.
Has anybody ever measured that? Is that a big effect?
Yes.
Or negligible?
Yes, that goes into, we call these climate accounting. So we have developed means to count how much of the emissions get sunk. We call these six. On the first point, so can the US supply as much natural gas as Germany needs? Not with US sources only, but the US has already been lobbying in the Middle East to tell countries that produce gas, Bahrain and a few others, the United Arab Emirates, to basically start producing to capacity. And what happened is that a number of vessels that were taking natural gas to China were asked to turn around and go to Europe. So now what we have is an army of vessels that are basically taking natural gas from China to Europe. And the Americans and the Europeans are basically telling the Chinese, tough luck, you've made a number of wrong choices, so now we're sending those back home. And you might have seen Putin and Xi Jinping together at the Olympics for a number of reasons. One of them, Xi Jinping told Russia, I know what's coming. I want all of your natural gas because those in the West have taken those tankers and told them to turn around. So at around Christmas, when we're all busy catching COVID and having a beautiful time with the family, all of those vessels somewhere in around India that were going to China were ordered to turn around and go to Europe. So now what we're finding is ports in Europe that have the capacity to take all of that gas from those tankers and put it in the pipeline and reverse the pipeline from the east to the west and send it from the west to the east. So they're going to Spain, they're going to France, and make sure that they're there to supply enough to Germany. Canada has a huge supply of natural gas. They've been trying to get it to China and they couldn't. So Canada is saying, well, we have as much as you need, we just have to get it out. This is the problem. So if the Americans are willing to let us cross through the country, we can get it out there. So there is a political push to get as much as necessary. Germany has to commit. So that's the key. And tell the Russians that, well, you're going to be left alone. You're going to have to eat it or sell it to China. On the question on counting the emissions, yes. So the plants will absorb a lot of these greenhouse gases. We call those sinks. So when we calculate the emissions and the offsets, normally you count how much greenhouse gas you generate minus how much is sequestered by the trees, the bogs, the swamps, etc. Swamps capture a huge amount of natural gas. So this is one of the problems we have in the Midwest. This was swampland, they were mostly drained. So the biggest sink for natural gas is mostly gone. So the biggest one we have now is the trees, which is not the best, but it's okay. I think there is another question at the back. There's 2 or 3. Yeah.
I'm inclined to think we should develop nuclear power by some of the means that are not the most common. For example, Bill Gates has invested in traveling water, and I don't know much more about it than the name, but it has some advantages. The point is that nuclear, there are 2 or 3 versions that would reduce the downsides of the nuclear plants we've seen in the past, and would have the round-the-clock, regardless of the weather, whether the sun was blowing or the sun was shining and the wind was blowing.
Yeah, the problem with nuclear is that because nobody wants to sit next to the waste. I mean, I always ask my student who wants to put it under the bed. I mean, when nuclear was promoted in the 1960s and 70s, it was thought to be a very reliable, nationally made source of energy. And the government said, go build nuclear power plants, we'll take the waste and find a place to put it to rest. But the US hasn't. The government hasn't been able to find a place. And by law, the US is supposed to pay for the cost of storing nuclear energy on site. So all of the waste is on site. So the nuclear power plant that just shut down north of here a few years ago, all the waste is there. I sometimes like to take my students to Illinois Beach State Park. I don't know if you've been there. It's one of the few parts of Illinois on Lake Michigan that hasn't been developed. And that's because there is a decommissioned nuclear power plant. It had 2 towers, and one of them sunk, just tilted a couple of years ago. So they had to take all of the waste out, take it down, and then put the waste in the other. So you do have a number of problems, especially if you build a nuclear power plant on sand. Sand is not very stable. And that's what we've done on the shores of Lake Michigan. So that is a problem. So technically speaking, you're correct. Nuclear is reliable and it's mostly safe until it isn't anymore. And we've seen the problem with Fukushima. We saw the problem in Ukraine as well. And by the way, the Ukrainians are trying to force the Russian army through Chernobyl. So they're hoping that if there is a war, the front will stabilize there and the Russian soldiers will start picking up that radiation, and they will, if they know, choose to go away. So if you have a pile of waste, you might as well use it against your neighbors. They seem to be thinking. It's the shortest route to Kiev, and Kiev has that going for itself right now. Who would have thought? Yes, I think there is a couple of questions at the back.
City of Franklin Environmental Commission, I'm a member for 7 years. Thank you so much, Professor Toral, for this presentation. We both have a common denominator, and that is education. So I need a visual here. Let me wrap my brain around storage of solar energy and wind energy. A storage facility, give me a concept of the size, the footprint of it, what careers are necessary to administer this stored energy.
So that is a very, well, thank you very much for your kind words, and I celebrate that you guys have a sustainability commission. Beloit doesn't. So it's been trying to create one for a while, but we have this problem. The city staff is saying, we have so few people, we can't pick up more jobs. So this is one of the next frontiers of renewable energy, particularly for solar and wind. Storing that is a challenge. So you need batteries, but those batteries require lithium, or there is a number of different technologies that are being tested that are also in high demand for electric cars. So not all of the stars are aligning on that front. But what we're talking about is a viable storage facility would be the size of a power plant. So if you could use the power plant that is not burning coal here in the Milwaukee area, or burning natural gas, and we put gigantic batteries there, that would be enough. But having said that too, I always tell my students this. I mean, storing energy is actually a lot simpler than you think. And I always use my house is an example. I don't run the AC in the winter, and I hardly run the heat in the AC in the summer, never, and the heat in the winter, because my house, well, I shouldn't say I built a house. I'm in the process of building my own house. I'm following a German architectural approach called passive housing, which is really pretty much common sense. The idea is that you build the conditions of the place. So what I did is I put a lot of insulation around, smaller windows to the north, bigger windows to the east and west to let the sun in the morning and evening, so I don't have to turn on the lights, and gigantic windows to the south. So what happens is that yesterday, for example, at some point, neighbor came over and said, "Why is it so hot in here?" And it's hot in here because the sun is hitting the house and it's trapping the heat. So I'm using my house for storage. So when we think about storage, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Let's think about what we do at home. So, and the same holds true in a hot summer day. If you open your windows at night, it gets cool. Then you close them, you trap the cool air in there. So of course, that assumes a number of things. That you leave the windows open at night like I do. That you live in a safe place. So I have to say that, I live in a safe community. But so there's a lot of privilege there. So, but, we do actually have the means to make a bigger difference than we can. And when I say it gets really hot and humid in Wisconsin, and I literally do not use my AC in the summer. My house never gets hotter than 77, 78. I keep it cool. I mean, our heat waves don't last so long. Close my windows in the morning. I'm set for the rest of the day. The sun, luckily, fortunately, is here. Even the coldest days of the year are sunny. So I remember 2 years ago, I have a friend who came to help me build my house, and we put in a wood-burning stove in the house. And we used it for the first time, and I remember it was below zero. It was a very, very cold day in early February. So by the time we started to get the fire going, the sun was already hitting the house, and the temperature in the house was 65 degrees, just from the sun, even though it was below zero outside. When we put the fire there, the temperature shot up to 85 degrees. We had to open the doors. I had never used this before. I never knew that the house would trap so much heat in the house. And I remember my neighbor coming over. "You guys are looking like you're in Hawaii." I'm like, "Well, come in here, see this." So yeah, there is a lot that we can actually do that is very, very low stakes. Use the right insulation. If you live in a place where you can leave the windows open in the summer at night, do. In the winter, or probably not winter, but spring, just a few days when the temperature outside rises to 70 degrees, you open the windows, do that. Those are really, really simple solutions that we can all do. I'm really not answering your question about what kinds of engineering and technology we need. We need the kind of technology we're using to build the batteries for electric cars, but we need to make them at a bigger scale, and we don't have the economics with us just yet. They would have to be too big. It wouldn't fit in a place. We can't store all of the renewable energy to power a gigantic city like Milwaukee is. So we need to continue to develop more efficient storage capacity. But we can still make a difference and use geothermal to our advantage. Another thing that I did that really paid off is my house is a really old house, and I decided to build a basement. And under the basement, I lifted it up, and I put a passive radon system, which basically what it does, in Wisconsin we have a lot of radon, so you have to let the air from your house out, or otherwise you're developing lung cancer. So I did that to get it automatically out. So what it does is that it produces a layer of hot air below my house, which keeps the temperature really warm in the basement. So the basement really doesn't need to be heated, even now it's always warm. So it's all these little things. It's not really rocket science. But we're not educating the people well enough. It cost me about $250 to do. And I don't have to heat my basement. And the basement is hot, so it keeps, because the heat goes up, it keeps the floor of the house warmer, so the feet are warm. So which is really, really important. So yeah, I think there is a question back there.
I'm glad you mentioned electric cars. That was my question. We're being told by the politicians that this is going to be the answer to climate change. And I just wonder what's going to generate the electricity to charge these cars?
Yes, and that is a very good question, because electric cars could actually be worse for the environment. If you actually use a car powered by gasoline and you get an electric in a place where energy comes from coal, you're actually increasing your greenhouse gas emissions. So you should not get an electric car if your energy is dirtier than gasoline. And we tend to think blindly that an electric car is better for the environment. It is in the long run, but it has to be running out there for more than a decade. Because the number of the components that go into making the battery of the car is using lithium. Lithium is very dirty to mine. It has a tremendous environmental footprint as well in South America, where we're getting it, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Argentina. So when you factor in all of those conditions, electric cars are not necessarily always the right answer. Normally they are, but you have to, if you like to change your car every month, like a friend of mine, I'm exaggerating, but I think he's gone through 10 cars in 10 years, he should never get an electric car. So you need, again, every individual is different. Think about your driving patterns, think about where you actually charge your car, and think about for how long you can keep your car. And if you do drive your car for a decade and you are in a place that does not generate energy from coal, then you're okay.
Like Vermont.
Vermont would be a great place to have an electric car, yes. Madison.
Not bad.
Just assuming that, excuse me, that we succeed in reducing climate change, and we even pull the climate back to what we had in the 1950s, who's going to take responsibility for the countries that suffer from that, such as Russia, that's not going to grow any more grain like they didn't do in the 50s and 60s, where they were buying it from us. And right now we're talking about paying third world countries to combat the ocean rising. And if we counteract that, other countries are going to lose not being able to produce food. Canada would probably be another one.
Yes, so this is, so every time there is change, there is winners and there is losers. And that's why the farmers of Iowa organize themselves to win out of renewables, but in Wisconsin they haven't. So they're not really getting the extra lease from panels, etc. And this is another one of those problems. So what's going to happen to the economies of the Middle East if we move away from oil? They have to diversify, and that's why Biden is trying to work with the United Arab Emirates to try to get them to move in the direction of greener technologies, so that when we stop burning natural gas, they don't collapse. That is a fantastic question. We all know the change is coming. The question is, do you want to wait and sit until it hits you, or do you want to be proactive like those energy companies in Oklahoma and Texas who said, we're going to be at the forefront of renewables as well and diversify? So this is one of the things that's fascinating about business in particular. There are businesses that are risk takers, and there are ones that are not so much. Some businesses will diversify, some of them will not. And from a social perspective, some will probably perish, and they should if they make the wrong decisions.
I have a question. Comment was made earlier about education. Is there any attempt to help to educate our legislators to what perhaps could be a good solution for Wisconsin?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier today that we are the best source of education for them by making noise about the things that we care about. So if we believe that we should act on climate, let's go to an event like this where someone running for office is talking and tell them that this is important. What is your climate plan? And I remember that when there were elections to the city council in Beloit a few years ago, one of the candidates running for office who didn't get elected, wasn't even close, said, I'm not a politician, I'm not corrupt, I don't know anything, doesn't matter what you ask me, I don't know the answer to it, and I'm proud of that. I was just thinking, really? I mean, So that sounds to me like the wrong platform. It's like, you know, you go in for brain surgery and the surgeon says, I don't know anything about this. But I'm not corrupt. So, no, I mean, I think education is very important. And if the people running for office don't know, we need to educate them. And we do that through what we mentioned, foregrounding. Making sure that the things that matter to the community are out there. So we need to make a lot of noise and keep pushing for it.
I think one thing that is nice about all of this is scientifically we're working good ways, but the population is, what, twice as much as it was in 1950. And nobody's touching on that equation at all. And just like this gentleman said, how are we going to feed these people? I remember kids were starving in India and in China, and we should send grain, and then they got the Green Revolution and we're going to have more food. Well, you can only get so much blood out of a turnip, and we're at the tipping point, but we're still producing kids like crazy.
Yeah, that was a big debate in the 1950s, 1980s, the population bomb. The Ehrlichs wrote a book saying, you know, if population keeps increasing at this exponential rate, we're going to reach the limits to growth. Donella Meadows was an Italian scientist who led a very interesting study about this, and they were calculating where we're going to be reaching Armageddon based on all of these, inputs and the technology at the time, and the idea was by the year 2000. So they got it wrong, but they got something right. You're right. So the more people that we bring to the world, the more pressure we're putting on the environment, unless we change the way that we do things, like the plants. I mean, the problem that we have, and this is one of the things that I find that my students have a hard time learning, is the idea that waste does not have to be produced. Waste is, as I mentioned, our outputs are someone's inputs. If we pile them up, nature is not going to be able to process them. So we have to be very careful and make sure that what we do it with a clear understanding of the impact of actions on the environment. And if we do that, we'll have healthier communities and we'll have better environment. But it does require change, it does require education, and it requires a lot of work, otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. And as a colleague of mine likes to say, the more problems they have in the world, the better off I am, job security, because I specialize in the bad stuff. So, I mean, it's a very cynical view, but, you know, in a way, I think that very often, at least the people who do the kind of research that I do, we only get an invitation to talk about the ugly part of things, not necessarily the success stories. And I always like to actually brighten up my lectures and my assignments for the students, particularly the students. The students get really down if they don't see any hope. So I like to say, okay, you could be Wisconsin, but thankfully we have Iowa and North Dakota. And they go like, North Dakota? They're like thinking Massachusetts. Well, let's look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts is dirty. So, you know, it's amazing all these assumptions that they bring with them, but there is good stories out there. There's people doing the right thing, and I think we need to showcase those people and put them in positions of power. We don't always do that.
I think you've given us all a lot to think about, and we'll all go home and turn down our thermostats.
Thank you. I remember a scientist that was a very prominent, one of the leading climate scientists that we invited to Beloit College to give a presentation, and somebody asked him, you know, what is the best source of energy that we should all, you know, go after to actually warm ourselves up? He said, how about a wool sweater? Talk to grandma and ask grandma to make you one. You know, they're hardy, they keep you warm even when wet, and if you treat them well and fix them up, they'll keep going and going and going and going and going forever. So very often the solution is a lot simpler than we think. Yeah, and I apologize to the Madisonians watching on this video. I love Madison. So, but you know, it's Pleasantville there, so we have to point out a few of the uglies. So, Madison, please think about Milwaukee, think about Beloit as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.